On a warm afternoon in Rhode Island in the summer of 2003, a 50-year-old man flipped burgers on the grill while sipping a beer. He had moved to the area for a job a few years ago, but he still felt like the new guy at work. And so a midsummer barbecue was a perfect excuse to get the whole team together for some extracurricular bonding. As the sun set and the backyard full of people turned dark, he crouched down to plug in some lights strung along the deck. But as he bent over, he felt a sudden surge from his gut. He lurched to the edge of the lawn, fell to his knees, and heaved as stomach acid and half-digested food flowed up into his throat and spilled out of his mouth. The man's coworkers rushed over with napkins and water and helped prop him up against the railing. Once he was upright, his stomach gradually settled, and after the man got over his embarrassment, the party returned to normal. But the experience confused and disturbed him. He wasn't drunk. He hadn't been nauseous. It hadn't really even felt like he was vomiting exactly. It was like the contents of his stomach had just decided to exit his body, and he was powerless to stop it. From Ballin Studios and Wondery, I'm Mr. Ballin, and this is MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new, baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. So, if you like today's story, please invite the follow button to a quiet study session in the library, and just as they begin to focus, start rhythmically tapping your pencil on the desk non-stop, humming off-key versions of popular songs. This episode is called It Comes Back. In the summer of 1982, a corporate sales director named Roger Donovan walked up the steps of a suburban house in Detroit, Michigan, and knocked on the door. It was his 29th birthday, and one of his coworkers had insisted on throwing him a party. When the door swung open, nearly half his office was clustered inside, and they all shouted happy birthday and blew noisemakers. Roger had only been at the job for about a year, so he really appreciated the warm welcome, especially since lately he'd been feeling strange and kind of lousy. He developed a nasty wet cough, despite not being congested or sick. Some nights it got so bad he couldn't get to sleep, which left him feeling wrecked in the morning. He hoped it was just some weird seasonal allergy thing, and so he was just trying to tough it out. So for now, this party was a pleasant distraction. Roger had some drinks and snacks and caught up with a few coworkers he rarely got a chance to chat with. But towards the end, he found himself in the back patio near a group of people who were smoking. Although Roger himself had never been a smoker, being around smokers didn't usually bother him. But tonight, the smoke triggered his cough, and once it started, Roger couldn't stop. It got so intense that he felt embarrassed and decided to leave. But on the drive home, the cough stirred up this churning in his stomach. He could feel liquids sloshing around inside of him, and it made him feel queasy. Roger thought back to what he had eaten at the party, but there was nothing out of the ordinary, except for maybe a slice of birthday cake, which he didn't eat very often. And so he couldn't figure out why he was having so much gastric distress. Back at his house, where Roger lived alone, he turned on the TV and laid on the couch. He hoped being sedentary would help calm his stomach down. But only minutes after laying down, Roger began coughing heavily again, and then felt the surge of nausea that immediately forced him to sit up straight. And as he was sitting there, he began sipping some water, and eventually he sort of calmed down and caught his breath, but he still felt rattled by what his body was doing. Crawling into his bed later that night, Roger wondered if maybe he had developed some new allergy to something, or if the coughing indicated a respiratory problem, like bronchitis. Either way, it worried him, because it was new, and because he had no idea what could be causing it. Clutching a pillow to his still churning stomach, he realized it was probably time to see a doctor. A few days later, Roger sat on the examination table in the office of a local pulmonologist, which is a doctor who specializes in the respiratory system. The doctor held a stethoscope to Roger's chest and asked him to take in a few deep breaths. After a minute of doing this, the doctor nodded, removed the stethoscope from his ears, and told Roger that his breathing sounded like he had asthma. Roger was surprised because he'd always lived a very active life and never had any breathing issues before. The doctor shrugged and explained that asthma can start at any age and can range from very mild to severe. He thought Roger most likely had what's called late-onset asthma, which is actually very common in adults. He prescribed Roger an inhaler and told him that using it frequently would make a big difference in his cough and breathing. He also advised Roger to see a gastroenterologist for any of his digestion issues. Roger took his advice and a few days later visited with a recommended local gastroenterologist named Dr. Ostrander. And after listening to Roger's organs and asking some questions about Roger's medical history, Dr. Ostrander concluded that Roger probably had acid reflux. This would explain Roger's nausea, his digestive pain, and his coughing. At first, Roger was skeptical of this diagnosis. He had never had digestion issues before, and he found it especially odd that it would set in at the same time as his late-onset asthma. Why would all of this just start now, out of the blue? Dr. Ostrander wasn't a lung specialist, so he wasn't really sure about if and how the asthma played a role in the acid reflux. But he said it's not usually connected to something like acid reflux. He explained that for most people, acid reflux is not something a person has their whole life. It comes and goes, depending on a variety of factors. Sometimes it's triggered by eating unusually rich foods, or lying down too soon after a big meal, or stress, or smoking cigarettes, or even certain medications can cause it. Dr. Ostrander explained that when food travels down the esophagus to the stomach, sometimes the sphincter muscle at the bottom of the esophagus relaxes at the wrong time, or it relaxes too much. That allows stomach acid to flow back up into the esophagus, which can cause heartburn, nausea, or stomach pain. And if the stomach acid sloshes high enough, it spills into the lungs, and that can block the airway. And so the doctor speculated that this could be the source of Roger's cough. Dr. Ostrander prescribed Roger some medication to help reduce his stomach acid production. But otherwise, he told Roger not to worry too much and just be aware of his diet in case there might be a particular food triggering all of his symptoms. A few months later, on a rainy autumn evening, Roger sat inside on his couch, feeling defeated. He had been using his inhaler diligently for months, but he hadn't noticed a difference. His cough was the same. And the meds had done nothing for his acid reflux. Even on nights when Roger went out of his way to eat an extra bland, simple dinner to avoid irritating his stomach, he'd still feel a surge of nausea as soon as he laid down. The Michigan weather didn't help either. Once summer ended and the temperature started to plummet, the chill of the air would sting Roger's lungs, particularly on early mornings before work. By the time full-on winter hit, Roger knew he'd basically have to stay indoors because outside, he'd struggle to breathe. Being cooped up inside so much only darkened Roger's already dark mood. But he hoped that eventually, somehow, his body would acclimate to whatever was going on, and he'd come out on the other side. In the meantime, he took another puff on his inhaler and laid back down on the couch. About 10 years later, Roger walked alone down a dark and silent suburban street late at night. The only sound was his footsteps echoing on the concrete and the occasional huff of his inhaler. Walks like these had become routine for Roger. Over the past decade, his cough and digestion problems had steadily worsened. Roger relocated to Augusta, Georgia for a new job last year, but that hadn't helped. It was a welcome change from breathing the frigid air of Midwestern winters, but even in the warmer southern climate, he often woke up with liquid in his lungs, causing him to cough until he vomited. These fits left him feeling delirious and nauseous, so he began taking late-night walks around the neighborhood just to settle his stomach. As Roger slowly shuffled along the empty streets, he felt depressed and disoriented. He'd recently turned 40, which he worried might be a health tipping point. What if his stomach issues and coughing only got worse with age? Roger took another puff on his inhaler and sighed. He didn't understand why all the doctors he had visited over the years had accomplished so little. At this point, Roger had been taking acid reflux medication and using his inhaler for a decade straight, yet his symptoms really had not improved in the slightest. And the lack of sleep as a result of these symptoms that were just not being curbed was really taking a toll on him and beginning to affect his performance at work. As Roger looped back towards home, letting his thoughts wander, he suddenly noticed an odd sensation in his chest, an unfamiliar pressure he'd never felt before. He stopped under a streetlight and ran a finger over his chest, trying to sense where this pressure was located. Roger took a slow, deep breath and abruptly stopped. There it was again. The moment air filled his lungs, he could sense it. There was this soft pressure at the base of his lungs. It was almost like there was an invisible hand inside of his abdomen, literally holding his lungs up. Roger shook his head, totally confused. I mean, who could actually feel their lungs? That's not a sensation you get. And so now, in addition to all these terrible symptoms he had had for years, Roger wondered if he was also starting to lose his mind. Another decade later, on a cold morning in the fall of 2003, Roger sat at the edge of an indoor swimming pool in suburban Rhode Island. His brain still felt blurry from yet another bad night's sleep, but he hoped a good swim would set him straight. After 8 years in Georgia and countless doctor's visits that led nowhere, Roger decided he needed a major change. He was approaching 50 years old and felt like he was in a bit of a rut, so he applied for and landed a job near Providence, Rhode Island as the vice president of a technology company. Roger was coming up on 3 years at this new job and had grown to love the team there. But unfortunately, his health problems had come with him. His cough had steadily worsened over the years, lasting longer and cutting deeper. The acid in his stomach sloshed around and went up into his esophagus anytime he wasn't actively standing upright. As a result, he had taken to sleeping on a mound of pillows to try to keep his body somewhat propped upright. It was not comfortable, but otherwise he'd be woken up by a sudden surge of vomit. In an effort to strengthen his breathing, Roger had found a local health club with an indoor pool and started swimming most mornings before work. It was the only activity Roger had discovered where his body could be horizontal and not trigger his symptoms. He didn't understand why, but he embraced it. Swimming had become, by far, the best part of his day. Once he was ready, Roger took a deep breath, dove into the water, and swam all the way to the other side. After a couple of warm-up laps, he tried testing how far he could swim while holding his breath underwater, surprising himself by making it 2 whole lengths of the pool. As he climbed out and toweled off, Roger felt energized. He also felt confident that whatever his health issues were, he did not have asthma. There is no way he'd be able to hold his breath so long and swim so vigorously if he did. It would also explain why the inhaler had never made a difference in 20 years. Roger was tempted to just throw the inhaler away. A couple weeks later, Roger hosted a barbecue party and suffered the worst flare-up of symptoms he'd ever had in over 20 years. While he was grilling burgers for his coworkers, Roger at some point had casually bent over to plug something in, and a torrent of half-digested food surged out of his mouth. There was so much stomach acid leaving his body that Roger fell to his knees, unable to breathe, and feeling this terrible burning sensation all along his esophagus. The experience was a wake-up call. Roger had to face the truth. His condition was not something he could just keep ignoring. It was only intensifying over time, and his body was starting to lose the fight against it. A week after the barbecue, Roger's colleagues stopped him in the hallways to ask how he was feeling. By now, word had spread. Everyone knew something was seriously wrong with Roger's health. But as much as he tried to act like it was no big deal, privately, Roger was starting to panic. He knew his life could not go on like this forever. He had been battered by the same digestive and respiratory symptoms for decades, and clearly they were not going anywhere. The thought of fighting this battle for decades more to come felt unbearable. But Roger did bear it without relief for 20 more years. And he did that by distracting himself by focusing on his career. After leaving Rhode Island in 2008, Roger had hopped around to a few different places before finally landing the biggest opportunity of his life in 2014. He was named the chief marketing officer for a fabric manufacturer in Cleveland. On a spring morning in 2023, Roger strolled through the company's massive industrial warehouse to inspect a new delivery of fabrics all neatly stacked on pallets. Although he'd recently turned 70, Roger had no intentions of retiring anytime soon. However, the harsh chemicals used to clean the knitting machinery wreaked havoc on his lungs. Even before COVID hit, Roger had taken to wearing a mask in the warehouse to avoid exposing others to his coughing. Even so, his coughing fits only continued to get worse. Many days, Roger would be forced to make an excuse in order to hurry to his office, lock the door, and hack until he vomited into a trash can. Then he would wait until the entire office emptied out to dispose of the vomit in a toilet. And the nights after work were very lonely, because his condition made it impossible to socialize. Roger's digestive system was too fragile. He dreaded going to bed, knowing that his cough would inevitably wake him in a fit. The lack of sleep continued to add up, and he was older now and really felt his age, and so it wasn't as easy to bounce back in the mornings. Then came the breaking point. Later that week, in the middle of the night, Roger woke with his usual cough and stumbled to the refrigerator to fill a glass of cold water. But he couldn't make it. A sharp pang in his chest made his knees wobble, and he slumped onto the couch. Roger tried to take slow, deep breaths, but his lungs felt shrunken. The shortness of breath made him so dizzy, he worried he was about to pass out. Lying there motionless, waiting for his body to stabilize, it hit Roger with total clarity. It could not go on like this. It was no longer bearable. When his alarm went off later that morning, Roger called his primary care physician and booked the next available appointment. A couple days later, in the middle of the weekly staff meeting, Roger's cell phone vibrated with a voicemail from his doctor. Roger had been on edge, waiting to hear back about the results of a CT scan. At his appointment a few days ago, Roger's doctor had theorized that Roger might have chronic bronchitis. That would explain the wet, nagging cough. He proposed a CT scan to look for inflammation in the tubes connecting the windpipe to the lungs, which Roger agreed to. But the last 48 hours after the scan had dragged by as Roger's head swirled with worries. He hoped whatever news he got would finally put the years of uncertainty to rest. Apologizing for the interruption, Roger stepped into the hallway to return the call. And as soon as he heard his doctor's voice, he could tell something was very serious. The doctor spoke calmly and urged Roger not to worry until they knew more, but his CT scan had come back showing dark spots across his lungs. These could be one of many things, but among the possibilities, unfortunately, was cancer. Roger's heart sank. A part of him had always dreaded that his condition might be something truly terrible. Slipping the phone back into his pocket, Roger returned to the meeting. His coworkers carried on with business as usual, but Roger's mind was elsewhere, reeling at how everything in his life could have led to this. Dr. Gregory Crane had heard plenty of unusual medical histories over his many years as a pulmonologist in Cleveland, but the 70-year-old man sitting in his office was a rare case. Roger's story spanned so many different jobs and cities and major life changes, yet throughout them all, his symptoms had never improved. And then when Roger explained how he could actually feel his lungs, like there was a phantom hand inside of his body, Dr. Crane was riveted. Roger had been referred to Dr. Crane after receiving his CT scan results. Although it took multiple tests to prove it, Roger's doctor eventually determined that those dark spots on his scan were not cancerous. But despite this good news, Dr. Crane could plainly see that Roger was not a healthy man. His eyes were sunken and his skin looked gray from fatigue and the exhaustion of constant coughing. Ruling out cancer was a relief, but it didn't solve the much bigger question of what was causing Roger's condition. Dr. Crane's first thought was that Roger must have some unusual type of asthma. But Roger was quick to explain how previous doctors had diagnosed him similarly, yet 4 decades of using an inhaler had not helped at all. And so after running some additional tests, Dr. Crane told Roger something that no doctor had told him in 40 years. Roger's hunch was right. He definitely was not asthmatic. All those huffs on the inhaler had been for nothing. Roger sighed, shook his head, and then pulled out his inhaler and chucked it at the small trash can in the corner of the room. But he missed, and it hit the floor. When Roger stood up to pick up the inhaler, he suddenly began coughing violently. He quickly stood back upright, and the cough died down. But the sight of Roger bent over gave Dr. Crane an idea. He told Roger there was one more test he wanted to run. One morning the following week, Roger dragged himself out of bed after another ragged, sleepless night. His head felt tingly and hollow from being awoken every couple of hours in a fit of coughing. No matter how simply he streamlined his diet, or what angle he propped himself at to go to bed, his stomach still churned and his lungs still felt blocked. As an increasingly elderly man, Roger worried he would not be able to keep fighting this off much longer. Today, however, he felt more optimistic than usual. He had a special procedure planned with Dr. Crane that he actually had high hopes for. Roger showered, but then skipped coffee and breakfast because he was told not to eat or drink anything for 4 hours before this operation. At the hospital, Roger was led to a room where a technician was preparing a computer monitoring system. Roger felt a bit nervous, but more than that, he felt desperate. His body was beaten down by fatigue. This procedure seemed like his last chance. There was a knock at the door, and Dr. Crane entered, followed by a nurse carrying a kit of medical equipment. Dr. Crane told Roger to lay on the hospital bed and try to relax. Roger did his best, but flinched when Dr. Crane moved close, holding a thin, flexible catheter. Dr. Crane had warned Roger that this procedure would be uncomfortable, but even though Roger knew that, now that it was happening, it was hard not to be anxious. The first thing Dr. Crane did was he sprayed a numbing medication up Roger's nostrils and into the back of his throat. After that, he guided the tube up Roger's nose while the nurse handed Roger a cup of water to drink. With each swallow, Dr. Crane slid the catheter further and further down Roger's esophagus until it reached the entrance of his stomach. Roger almost gagged many times, but managed not to break into a coughing fit. Once the catheter was secure, Dr. Crane looped it over Roger's ear and connected it to a small computer about the size of a smartphone. Then he attached the computer to a belt, which Roger was to wear for the next 24 hours. Roger could eat and drink like normal, but he would need to keep a diary of his meals, activities, and symptoms. Meanwhile, the tip of the catheter inside of Roger would be recording the levels of acid in Roger's esophagus and transmitting them to the computer. The rest of Roger's day was bizarre. Doing anything with a catheter up your nose and down your throat was awkward. He had told his boss he was taking that day off for medical reasons, so he had plenty of time to kill. Roger went for a long walk in a nearby park, then bought some groceries, and made dinner for himself while watching TV. Nighttime felt long, strange, and uncomfortable. Roger's stomach was irritated by the tubing, and his breathing was as bad as ever. Lying in bed, staring up at the ceiling with a bulky belt around his waist strapped to a computer, Roger felt a little ridiculous. But he had run out of options in his life. And so at this point, even the smallest sliver of a chance that this procedure could help him was worth taking. And the next day, he found out it was definitely worth the risk. Dr. Crane had downloaded and studied the data from the computer, and the results were conclusive and shocking. The test that Dr. Crane had administered was called a 24-hour pH impedance test. By tracking the fluctuations in acid levels in Roger's esophagus across an entire day and night, he discovered something that no other doctor in 40 years ever had. Roger's esophagus was defective. He was missing a sphincter at the bottom of it. That meant there was no barrier between his esophagus and stomach like most people have. So there was nothing to stop the contents of his stomach from coming back up if his body was positioned at the wrong angle. And so night after night in bed, Roger's stomach fluids flowed up into his lungs. That's why he coughed so much at night and why walking around upright helped settle his stomach. Dr. Crane could not determine whether Roger was simply born without a sphincter in his esophagus or whether his sphincter had been damaged or destroyed over the years somehow. But regardless, the effect was the same. Roger's rare condition actually had a name. It was called non-erosive reflux disease. Roger was shocked as Dr. Crane explained his findings. All these years, he had imagined so many different outcomes, but this was never one of them. Dr. Crane referred Roger to a gastric surgeon colleague of his named Dr. Amanda Davenport to confirm his findings. But she soon discovered that a missing sphincter was not Roger's only medical curiosity. It would turn out the reason Roger could feel his lungs as if there was a phantom hand putting pressure at the bottom of his lungs was because his stomach had broken through the layer of muscle at the bottom of his lungs, called the diaphragm, and was actually pushed up against them. That meant the fluid in his stomach was directly next to his lungs. That pressure Roger felt came from the stomach fluids sloshing around because there was no sphincter to contain them. And so that was what he was feeling. Dr. Davenport was able to move Roger's stomach down, mend his diaphragm, and create a sphincter in his esophagus by using extra tissue from his stomach lining. And the operation was successful. And ever since, Roger's cough has vanished, and he can now bend and stoop and sleep in any position he wants without worrying. On the evening of October 28, 2006, in a Florida city called Port Richey, a 37-year-old woman named Marisa Weber walked in the front door of her home and called out a greeting to her mom. Her mom didn't call back, but Marisa could hear her in the kitchen making dinner, and so Marisa walked over to say hello. But Marisa only got about 2 feet into the family's very cramped living room when one of their many cats came bombing into the room and nearly knocked Marisa over as it ran past her and ran up to the side of the wall and just stopped and stared at the baseboard of the wall like there was something there. Marisa was totally annoyed by this cat, and as she looked over at it, she knew what it was doing, because lately Marisa had noticed there were clearly rats in her family's home, kind of scurrying around in the ceilings and the walls. Marisa could hear them all the time, and one of their cats was now clearly hunting one of these rats. And this totally stressed Marisa out. She'd actually begun taking anti-anxiety and antidepressant medication largely because of this rat infestation and really just the fact that Marisa hated living at her parents' home, but she didn't really have the means to go out and live in her own place, which she knew would solve the problem, and so she was just kind of stuck here. And so Marisa turned away from the cat and likely the rat behind the wall, and she made her way through the tight little living room into the kitchen, and she gave her mom a quick hug, and she saw her dad was also in the room as well, and he said hello to her. And then Marisa's mom offered her some food, but Marisa said, you know what, I'm not hungry, thank you. I'm just tired, I'm gonna go to bed. And so Marisa again gave her mom a hug, she said goodnight to her dad, and then she turned, walked up the stairs, and made her way to her bedroom. She went inside and shut the door. The next morning, Marisa's parents got up and they began making breakfast and getting ready for the day, but Marisa did not come downstairs, and so the parents assumed she must have left early for her job. Marisa was a secretary at a waste disposal company. And so the parents just had their breakfast and they too went out for their jobs. And then in the evening, when the parents were back home, Marisa did not come home at the time she normally would after work. But the parents were not actually that concerned right then because they figured, okay, well, maybe she left early and she came home from work early. And so we just kind of missed her on both ends. And that's why her door to her bedroom is shut. She's just come home early and she's in there and she wants to be left alone. After all, she's a 37-year-old woman. She probably wants her space. But later that night, when still the parents had not even heard their daughter moving around up there, the mother went upstairs and knocked on Marisa's bedroom door. But there was no answer. And so finally, Marisa's mom opened the door and the room was totally empty. Now, at this point, the parents did start to get concerned because they're thinking, okay, well, we didn't see her this morning. We haven't seen her now. We don't know where she is. But again, their daughter is 37 years old. And if she wanted to go do something out of the house by herself and not tell anyone, she was kind of entitled to do that. And so the parents ultimately decided that they would just let this go for now. And in the morning, they were sure to see her. But the next morning, the parents still had not heard from Marisa, she had not come home, and now they were officially starting to panic. In particular, the mother was worried that Marisa might have been kidnapped or something going to or coming back from work because Marisa was only 5'3" tall and maybe 100 pounds, so she was really small. And so Marisa's mom called her other daughter, Gina, in a total panic, saying, your sister, she's missing. We don't know where she is. She might have gotten kidnapped. Come over and help us figure out what's going on. And so Gina came over to the house. And when she came inside, she told her parents, let's stay calm here. Marisa, she's 37. I'm sure she's fine. Let's search the house and see if there's some note or something from Marisa explaining where she is and what she's doing. And so the family searched the whole house, starting with Marisa's room, but they couldn't find anything that gave them any clues about what happened to Marisa. But they did eventually find Marisa's purse that was still in her room, and when they opened it up, they saw her wallet was still inside. And so that sent up a huge red flag for the family. They're thinking, why would Marisa go anywhere for an extended period of time without her wallet? That made no sense. And so at this point, the family did call the police and they reported Marisa missing. But the police got nowhere on the case. And so on November 9th, so 12 days after Marisa had said goodnight to her parents, gone up to her room, and then vanished, the family was at a total loss for what to do. But Gina, Marissa's sister, had begun to think to herself, hey, it's possible that Marissa, who was not doing well mentally, she was very unhappy. She was totally stressed out about this rat infestation, which really highlighted the fact that she was stuck at home with her parents at 37 years old. Gina's thinking that it was totally possible that Marissa had just abruptly run away, or worse, maybe she had harmed herself. And so on November 9th, Gina decided she would take one more pass through the family home and just see if she could find any little indication that would give away what was going through Marissa's mind before she vanished. And where Gina started was in Marissa's room. And so Gina, she went upstairs, down the hall, she opened up her sister's bedroom, and she walked inside, and you gotta picture this space. It was totally cluttered, almost like a hoarder's space. There were piles of clothes that were taller than a human person. I mean, this room is totally packed with stuff. But Gina, she took her time kind of walking through the room, looking everywhere, kind of sifting through all the piles of junk and clothes and everything in the room, and she couldn't find anything. But then at some point, her attention was drawn to her sister's bookshelf. And she looked over at it, and she thought she saw something odd right in the middle of the shelf. Now, Gina had a flashlight with her, and even though the light was on in the room, she still lifted up the flashlight and turned it on and shined it at this thing in the middle of the bookcase. And when she saw it, she screamed. Based on Gina's discovery, here is what happened to Marissa Weber on October 28, 2006, the night she disappeared. That night, Marissa had come home. She saw her mom and dad in the kitchen. She was offered food. She turned it down and said, "I'm tired. I'm going to bed." She went upstairs. She went into her room, closed the door, and sat down on her bed. Then Marissa grabbed a pill bottle next to her bed, which contained morphine and codeine, which are two very powerful painkillers. They're opiates, so highly addictive. She popped a few of those, and then she rolled a marijuana joint and smoked that. And then she grabbed the TV remote and sat back on her bed, getting ready to zone out. But when she tried to turn on the TV, which was sitting on this bureau on the other side of the room, it didn't turn on. And right away, Marissa knew that the TV likely had become unplugged. This was something that happened periodically. The room was so packed with stuff that sometimes when Marissa was just navigating through her room, the stuff would bump into the bureau, and that would in turn jostle loose the plug from the TV. But the TV was actually not plugged in right behind where this bureau was. The TV was sitting on the bureau, but the plug ran down and kind of to the side of the bureau behind this huge bookcase that was pressed right up against the bureau. But this bookcase was so loaded down with books and things that Marissa had collected over the years that not only could you not really reach through the bookcase to the wall, but it was too heavy. You couldn't move the bookcase. And so the only way to access this plug from the TV was to climb on top of the bureau where the TV was and kind of reach back and grab the plug behind the bookcase and plug it back in. And so Marissa, who was likely beginning to feel the effects of all the drugs she had taken, climbed on top of this bureau and she reached back behind this 6-foot-tall bookcase and she began trying to grab the plug, but it was just out of reach. And so she leaned farther and farther and farther until she finally grabbed the plug. But when she managed to plug it back into the wall, she slipped forward and fell headfirst into this tiny space behind the bookshelf and the wall, and she got pinned upside down. Now, we don't know why Marissa didn't begin calling out for help. Perhaps she was so under the influence of these drugs that she couldn't really process the situation and didn't know what she should do. Or maybe she was embarrassed about the fact that she had somehow gotten trapped upside down behind her bookcase. But either way, she didn't call out for help right away. And unfortunately, what happens when a human body is trapped upside down long enough is all the blood rushes to the upper part of your body. It causes your eyes eventually to pop out of your head. It feels like your head's going to explode. But the real problem is all that blood pools around your lungs and restricts your lungs and makes it really hard to breathe. And critically, if you can't take a big breath in, you can't project your voice loud enough to call out for help. And so Marissa did not call out for help during those first critical few moments she was trapped behind the bookcase. And then when she realized she absolutely couldn't move, she didn't have the lung capacity to call out for help. And so likely for 1 or maybe even 2 days, Marisa remained upside down behind this bookshelf and likely was aware of her family coming in and out of her bedroom looking for her, but she was not able to vocalize. She could not get their attention, and so eventually she died. Marisa's family would say when they were looking for Marisa in her bedroom while she was dying behind the bookcase, they said they did hear sounds, but it sounded like the rats that were running all over their house, and so they didn't know it was actually likely Marisa moving around behind the bookcase trying to get their attention because she can't use her voice. And then after Marisa died, her family did continue to go back into her room to look for her, and they began to smell something funny, which was Marisa decomposing, but the family didn't know that, and they chalked it up to the fact that the room was really messy, and again, there are rats in this house. I mean, this was not a clean space, and so they kind of thought, okay, the smell can't be anything serious. It wasn't until November 9th, when Marisa's sister, Gina, was back in Marisa's bedroom, and she looked over at the bookcase, and she saw something strange. What she saw was her sister's foot right behind the bookcase. Gina couldn't really process it, so she got her flashlight out, she shined it on the foot, and when she scanned from the foot down, she realized it was her sister. Our next story is called Digging Sounds. On February 15th, 2004, two police officers drove down a quiet street in a little English village called Murrow, and they pulled over in front of this little brick bungalow. Earlier that day, a neighbor who lived on this street had called the police to report hearing a strange digging sound coming from inside of this bungalow. And so these officers had been sent out to see what the sound was and make sure the occupants of this home were okay. Now, these two officers were not particularly worried about the occupants of this house. They assumed that some wild animal must have snuck in while the owners were away, and that was all this was. But, as they would quickly learn, that was not the case. After climbing out of their car, the two officers just stopped and listened for a second to see if they could hear this digging sound, but the bungalow was quiet, the street was quiet, and so the two officers shut their car doors and made their way up to the front porch of this bungalow and knocked on the front door. After a few moments, when nobody answered, one of the officers reached down and tried the handle and found it was unlocked. And so he opened the door just a crack and he called out through this opening in the door into the bungalow saying, "Hey, it's police, we're here to check on you." But when no one called back to them, the officer opened the door the rest of the way, and immediately both officers saw there was a huge problem inside of this house. The entire first floor was flooded with several inches of water, and they could hear from somewhere in the back of the property the sound of running water. And so again, both officers called out into this house to try to get the attention of anyone who might be inside. And when again they were met with silence, the officers walked into the flooded house and began walking straight back towards this running water sound. And eventually, after walking through the living room, they entered this hallway that went right to the back of the property. And as soon as they were in it, they could see there was an open door at the end of the hallway on the left. And it seemed like the running water sound was coming out of that room. And so the two officers, one by one, sloshed down this hallway to this room. They turned left, looked inside, and what they saw completely shocked them and immediately sprung them into action. 2 months before these officers came to this bungalow and found it flooded with water, the owner of this bungalow, 51-year-old Ronald McClagish, had broken up with his girlfriend. And this breakup was really hard on Ronald. He was already divorced, he was totally broke, he had loads of health issues like bad asthma, he had some liver issues, and just generally he was someone who was kind of physically frail. And so this girlfriend had been one of the very few good things in his life, and now she was gone and he was alone again. And so very quickly after this breakup, Ronald fell into a very dark depression. And so for 6 weeks after they broke up, Ronald, for the most part, just stayed in bed and kind of moped around his bungalow, kind of feeling bad for himself. But then finally, at the end of those first 6 weeks after the breakup, Ronald decided he wanted to get his life back together and just move on. So, on February 1st, 2004, so roughly 2 weeks before those two officers would come to his bungalow because of this digging sound, Ronald would wake up feeling determined to start anew. And the first thing he was going to do was purge his bungalow of anything that was his ex-girlfriend's. She left a lot of things behind when they broke up. She had not collected them. And so now they were just kind of sources of pain. And where most of her stuff was inside of Ronald's bungalow was in this closet in one of the bedrooms at the end of the hall. So that morning, Ronald headed down the hall. He turned left into the bedroom. He opened up the closet. He went inside, and with a trash bag in hand, he began rifling through everything in this closet, and anything that was hers, he would take it and put it right into the trash bag. And at some point, when Ronald was almost done pulling the last few things of his girlfriend's out and into the trash bag, from behind him, he heard this strange sound coming from the bedroom. It sounded like wood bending or creaking. But before he could turn around to see what the sound was, the door to the closet he was in slammed shut with incredible force. And suddenly Ronald was trapped inside of this closet in total darkness. Now Ronald was likely shocked at first, but he would have reached and tried for the handle and found that no matter what he did, he could not open this closet again. And so Ronald began screaming for help and pounding on the door, but nobody came to help him. The closet that Ronald was in was fairly tall, but it was only 2 feet wide by about 2 feet deep, which meant Ronald could only stand inside of this closet. He couldn't sit down, he couldn't bend down, he literally was trapped standing. And Ronald didn't have water, he didn't have food, he knew that no one was going to be checking on him anytime soon, and even though his bungalow was kind of small and shabby, it was built out of brick. And so the likelihood that his calls for help were penetrating outside loud enough that people could hear them and that they would come in and rescue him was pretty slim. And so at some point that evening, Ronald realized he needed to do something different if he was going to get out of this closet. And so above him were a series of pipes across the ceiling. And so he reached up and he grabbed one of them and he broke it off. He was likely thinking that with this pipe, maybe he can burrow a hole in the wall and crawl through to another room, or maybe he can punch a hole in the door and somehow unlock it, or at a minimum, with the metal pipe, smashing it against the wall or the door would be louder than any noise he could make by yelling. However, the second he broke that pipe off the ceiling, something horrible happened. The pipe he broke was a water pipe. And as soon as it was broken, icy cold water began pouring down directly on top of Ronald's head and face. And again, because he can only stand basically in the middle of this closet, he couldn't get out of the way of this water. It was like he was under a waterfall and couldn't go anywhere. And so he likely tried to ignore the water and tried to use the pipe and screamed and do anything he could to get someone to know he was in here, but no one could hear him. And so it was like he was being tortured with this freezing water, and he's in this tight claustrophobic space. It's total darkness and he's totally panicking. And for days and days, that would be Ronald's nightmarish reality. But despite how terrible his circumstances were, Ronald continued to use that pipe to both smash the walls to make loud sounds. He also began burrowing into the walls, trying to make a hole. But Ronald was getting weaker and weaker. He became very sick. And also, because the water was constantly hitting his head and face, his skin got so saturated that literally his skin started falling off. It basically opened up into these sores and began to sag, and the water just began brushing his skin off. And so finally, after about a week of being trapped in this closet in these terrible conditions, Ronald realized help was not going to come in time, and so he put his pipe down, he kind of slumped up against the wall, and then closed his eyes. Ronald's neighbor, who called the police, actually did hear Ronald using that pipe to try to dig a hole in his wall, and she heard Ronald smashing the pipe on his door, and she must have heard muffled shrieks and yells. But she didn't know what they were and kind of just decided it wasn't her business. But when Ronald's house went from all these strange sounds to silence, that was when she called the police and said, hey, I had heard some digging sounds coming from the bungalow, and now I don't. And so when those two police officers arrived at Ronald's bungalow, they went inside, they went down the hallway, they went into the bedroom where Ronald had gone, and they saw this huge wardrobe, which is a big wooden piece of furniture, toppled over right in front of the closet. And at the bottom of the closet, they saw two human feet protruding from underneath that little space at the bottom of the closet. Those feet belonged to Ronald. He had managed to force his feet underneath the closet, but of course, he could not have fit underneath the closet door. And so the two police officers rushed over, and together, they barely were able to get this wardrobe off of the closet door. And when they opened the door up, Ronald was in there. He was deceased. His body was still in a standing position, kind of rigid and propped up against the wall, and freezing water was still pouring down onto his head. It would turn out no one had intentionally trapped Ronald. Instead, his wardrobe was just unstable, and it happened to topple over at the worst possible moment. The next and final story of today's episode is called The Mayor. In April of 1979, a 69-year-old woman named Monica Myers was appointed mayor of a little village called Betterton in the U.S. state of Maryland. Betterton used to be this very fancy resort town on the water where people from Baltimore and Philadelphia would come there for vacations. They had fancy hotels and restaurants and shops. But by the time Monica became Betterton's mayor, Betterton had kind of gone downhill. People had stopped coming to Betterton. All the hotels shut down or were abandoned or burned down. The summer homes of the rich people from the big cities, those got sold off. And down at the beach, all these glamorous boardwalks literally just kind of crumbled into the sea, and in their place were all these shanty towns where homeless people set up their camps. But Monica had grown up in Betterton, and so she really loved the town and wanted to improve it. And so when she became mayor in 1979, she really leaned into her new role way more than other mayors would. Instead of managing the village from an office like most mayors would do, Monica literally went out in town and just began doing lots of jobs around the town for free. She would ride around with the police and literally stop crimes in action. One time, she stumbled across someone looting a vacant hotel, and she personally got out, chased this person down, and made them put everything back that they had taken. She would pick up trash on the beach, she would do random repairs on people's homes and businesses all over town, and sometimes she would just go door to door asking people how they were doing. And so very quickly, the people of Betterton really grew to love Monica, and they loved seeing her every single day just out and about making Betterton a better place. And so, on March 20th, 1980, roughly 1 year into Monica's tenure as mayor, it was immediately noticeable to the people of Betterton when Monica was nowhere to be seen. That day, she did not go to the police station in the morning like she normally did. She was not seen at the beach doing her trash pickup, and she didn't knock on anybody's door. And so by mid-morning that day, the people of Betterton, all 120 of them, were basically out in force looking for Monica. And at 11:30 a.m., the police in Betterton got a call about Monica. It was this guy who was totally panicked. He could barely make a sentence. And he basically just told the police, you gotta get here now. And so the police hopped in their cars and they sped to the address this guy gave them. And when they got there, they saw it was this very plain, boxy building that was kind of tucked back in the woods. It was far away from the town center, and really nobody ever went over here. And the police, when they parked their cars, they saw the guy who had called the police, the distraught caller, was standing outside of the front door. He was obviously crying, and he was waving for them to come over and follow him into this building. And so the police got out of their cars, they ran over to this guy, and they're asking him, what happened? Where's Monica? What's going on? But this guy was so hysterical, he really could not describe what happened to Monica. He just kept telling them to come on, follow me. And so he led them into this building, and pretty quickly they entered this huge warehouse where all across the ceiling were these big metal catwalk areas that kind of zigged and zagged all over this warehouse. And below them, all over the floor, were these huge industrial-sized 15-foot tall vats that contained something. And so this guy who had led police here, he stops and he just points at the nearest vat. And so the police, picking up his cue, begin walking towards this vat. And as they got closer and closer, they were hit with this horrible smell that made them gag and cough. And before long, they had to stop and kind of compose themselves. The smell was so bad. It would turn out this building that was kind of removed from the town center of Betterton was Betterton's sewage treatment plant. And that morning, Monica had gone to the treatment plant to help clean some of these 15-foot tall industrial-sized vats that contained human waste. She had done this enough times that when she was here, she did not need any supervision. And so that morning, she was alone. She climbed up onto one of the catwalks over one of these big vats, and she had reached down with her testing kit to test the sewage to see how much cleaning it would need. And as she did that, she somehow slipped and fell into the big vat of human waste. Now, she would not have immediately gone under. It was not like a liquid. It was more like clay or really thick mud, where at first she would have kind of been laying on top of the sewage. But as soon as she tried to move to get out of the sewage would have functioned more like quicksand, where as soon as a part of her body went under the surface, it would not come up again. And so after the police composed themselves, they climbed up onto the catwalk and they looked down and they saw Monica, who was face down, partially submerged inside of this vat, and she was deceased. Her autopsy would reveal that she died of drowning, which means she literally inhaled human waste. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts: MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, and Runfool. Just search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts and you'll find them all. Also,